Day 49, Part 1. Are you ready? Jorge is traveling to Brazil by plane. He thinks the Brazilian culture is interesting. He wants to live in Brazil forever. Are you ready? Jorge is traveling to Brazil by plane. He thinks the Brazilian culture is interesting. He wants to live in Brazil forever. Part 2a. Present. Jorge is traveling to Brazil by plane. Is Jorge to Japan by plane? Jorge is traveling to Brazil by plane. He didn't travel to Japan. Where is Jorge traveling to? To Brazil. He's traveling to Brazil. Jorge is traveling to Brazil. Is Jorge traveling to Manuel, his apartment? No, he's traveling to Brazil. No, he isn't traveling his Manuel, his apartment. He's traveling to Brazil. How is Jorge traveling? By plane. Jorge is traveling by plane. He is traveling by plane. Is Jorge traveling by taxi? Jorge is traveling by plane. No, isn't traveling by taxi. Who's traveling by plane? Jorge. Jorge is traveling by plane. Where is Jorge traveling to? To Brazil. Jorge is traveling to Brazil. Part 2b. Past. Jorge was traveling to Brazil by plane. Was Jorge traveling to Japan by plane? Jorge is traveling to Brazil. Jorge was he was traveling to Japan. He was traveling to Brazil. Where was Jorge traveling to? To Brazil. Jorge was traveling to Brazil. Jorge was traveling to Brazil by plane. Was Jorge traveling to Manuel, his apartment? His apartment? No, he was traveling to Brazil. How was Jorge traveling? By plane. He was traveling by plane. By plane. He was traveling by plane. Was Jorge traveling by taxi? He was traveling by plane. No, wasn't traveling by taxi. Who was traveling by plane? Jorge. Jorge was traveling by plane. Where was Jorge traveling to? To Brazil. Jorge is traveling to Brazil. To Brazil. Jorge was traveling to Brazil by plane. Part 3a. Present. Jorge thinks the Brazilian culture is interesting. Jorge is there the Brazilian culture is boring? It's interesting, not boring. No, Jorge doesn't think that. Jorge, what does he think? The Brazilian culture is interesting. He thinks the Brazilian culture is interesting. Is this the thing the Brazilian culture is interesting or boring? It's interesting. He thinks the Brazilian culture is interesting. Boring? No, interesting. Does culture is boring interesting? No, no boring. The culture of Brazil, the Brazilian culture. Part 3b. Pass. Jorge, the Brazilian culture was interesting. Jorge thinks the Brazilian culture is boring? No, it's interesting. Jorge was in Brazilian culture. Jorge thinks the Brazilian culture was interesting. What did he think? He thinks the Brazilian culture is interesting. The culture was interesting. Is interesting or boring? Interesting. The Brazilian culture, it was interesting. His stuff is interesting. Part 4. Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. Does Jorge want to live in Sweden? No, Sweden. Jorge lives in Brazil. Jorge doesn't want to live in Brazil. He wants to live in Brazil. Where is Jorge want to live? Brazil. Jorge wants to live in Brazil. Jorge wants to live in Brazil. Does Jorge wants to live in Russia? No, Russia. Jorge wants to live in Brazil. Jorge wants to live in Brazil. He doesn't Russia. He wants to live in Brazil. Jorge wants to live in Brazil. Does Jorge want to live in Brazil forever? Yes, Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. Does Jorge want to live in Brazil for one day? No, one day. He wants to live in Brazil forever. No, only one day. He wants to live forever. Jorge wants to live in Brazil for 1 month. No, forever. Jorge wants to live in Brazil forever. For 1 year? Forever. He wants to live forever. No 1 year is there. He wants to live in Brazil forever. Part 5. Jorge, you traveling to Brazil by plane. You think the culture is interesting. You want to live in Brazil forever. In Brazil, you can learn the Portuguese language well. You can also meet interesting people. Good luck, Jorge. Personal question. Do you think the American culture is interesting? Yes, American culture is interesting.